The Roman army wasn't just powerful, it was frighteningly intelligent. Movies love to show chaotic battles and dramatic sword fights, but in reality, Rome won its wars with tactics that were far stranger, far smarter, and far more ruthless than anything Hollywood ever shows. These weren't just formations, they were psychological weapons designed to break enemy morale long before the first sword was drawn. Today, we're uncovering the Roman battle strategies that shocked ancient civilizations, crushed entire nations, and proved that Rome didn't conquer the world by accident. They conquered it with discipline, innovation, and terrifying precision. Number 1. The living wall that terrified the ancient world. The first Roman tactic that completely shattered enemy morale wasn't some heroic sword duel or a cavalry charge exploding across the field. It was the Testudo, the shield-tortoise. Modern movies show it, but they miss the details that made it disturbing to witness in real life. In battle, dozens of Roman legionaries didn't behave like individuals. They locked their shields with mathematical precision, the front shields overlapping forward, the side shields sealing the edges, and the top shields creating a roof strong enough to withstand a barrage of stones, arrows, and even heavy javelins. To enemies who were used to chaotic, noisy, emotional fighting, this formation looked unnatural. It didn't shout, it didn't rush, it just moved, slow, steady, unbreakable. Imagine standing on a hill, watching a silent metal creature advance toward you, shrugging off missile fire as if it were dust. That psychological pressure alone made many groups hesitate or break long before contact. The Testudo was designed for siege warfare, crossing deadly open ground where most armies were vulnerable. Arrows rained down, but failed to penetrate the layered shields. Slingers hurled lead bullets that normally cracked skulls, but against the Testudo, they simply bounced off like pebbles hitting a roof. Even massive stones thrown from defensive walls lost their momentum against the overlapping shield roof. This wasn't just defensive genius, it was domination by discipline. Every soldier in the Testudo had to trust the men around him completely. If one man flinched or broke formation, the entire shell risked collapsing. Only the Romans, with their relentless training and emphasis on unit cohesion, could pull it off at scale. When the formation came close enough to the enemy walls or defensive lines, everything changed. The Testudo suddenly opened, shields lifted aside, and dozens of legionaries burst forward with short stabbing swords designed specifically for tight, close-range destruction. It was like watching a calm storm suddenly unleash its power all at once. The Testudo wasn't simply about physical protection. It was pure psychological warfare. It told the enemy, long before contact was made, "You cannot stop us. You cannot scare us. We are coming no matter what you do." Number 2. The triple line that never got tired. Another tactic that shows just how advanced Roman thinking was on the battlefield is the Triplex Acies, the triple battle line. Modern audiences often imagine ancient warfare as one giant push, with both sides fighting until exhaustion. The Romans didn't fight like that. They approached battle the way modern athletes manage stamina rotating units before fatigue ever set in. The first line, the hastati, were younger, energetic fighters. They absorbed the initial impact, pushed forward aggressively, and tested the enemy's strength. If they couldn't break through, they didn't get wiped out. They simply withdrew in an orderly fashion through gaps intentionally left in the line. Behind them waited the Principe's more experienced soldiers, stronger, calmer, and trained to step in the moment the hastati pulled back. Fresh men from the second line kept pressure on the enemy, while the first line recovered behind them. And then there were the triarii, the veterans. These men were the final line, often older, battle-hardened, and used only when absolutely necessary. Their presence alone could prevent panic. Roman culture even adopted a saying from this system: "It has come to the triarii," meaning things had become extremely serious. While other armies relied on brute force or one massive charge, Rome relied on endurance and mental warfare. Facing the Triplex Acies meant fighting wave after wave of fresh enemies. Each time the opposing army thought victory was near, another disciplined Roman line replaced the last one seamlessly. This constant pressure broke morale long before bodies broke. What many people today overlook is how adaptable this system was. It functioned on plains, hills, forests, and rough terrain where other formations fell apart. The Romans engineered their army to withstand chaos, and the Triple Line was proof of that. It was a machine cold, efficient, and impossible to rush. The enemy tired faster, fought harder, and lost discipline sooner. Meanwhile, the Romans rotated, reorganized, and stayed sharp. It's no wonder their enemies often called Roman battles grinding or endless. They weren't fighting one force, they were fighting three. Number 3. The wedge that cut armies in half. When the Romans wanted to break an enemy formation quickly, they didn't rely on luck or brute force. They used precision. The wedge, or cunus, was shaped like a triangle with the strongest, most aggressive soldiers at the point. This wasn't just a pretty shape, it was a tactical weapon designed to pierce an enemy line and then split it apart. As the wedge moved forward, the weight of the soldiers behind the point kept pushing. The moment the tip broke through, the formation widened the gap like a splitting tool, forcing the enemy aside whether they wanted to move or not. Once a line was pierced, the army behind it fell into disarray. The Roman wedge crushed the Macedonian phalanx at Pydnia formation, considered nearly unbeatable for centuries. The Romans didn't attack it head-on like other Greek armies had tried. Instead, they targeted weak spots, pushed into the phalanx where the long pikes were less effective, and drove a wedge straight into the center. The entire phalanx collapsed. The same tactic saved Roman forces during the rebellion of Boudica in Britain. The Romans were heavily outnumbered. A direct defensive line would have been swallowed whole, but the wedge let them push forward into the disorganized mass, splitting it into smaller groups that could be crushed one at a time. Movies depict ancient armies smashing together like tidal waves. The Romans didn't believe in that. They fought with intention, always aiming to break the enemy mentally before breaking them physically. The wedge caused instant panic. Soldiers found themselves separated from their unit, unsure whether to fall back, regroup, or fight. And in the small window of hesitation, Roman legionaries pressed forward mercilessly. The wedge wasn't the most glamorous tactic, but it was one of the most terrifying, because it didn't just defeat armies, it dismantled them. Number 4. How Rome turned sea battles into land battles. One of the craziest Roman innovations didn't even happen on land. It happened at sea, where Rome started with absolutely no naval experience. During the early Punic Wars, Carthage dominated the Mediterranean with superior ships and veteran crews. Rome, meanwhile, had to build a navy from scratch. But the Romans realized something important. They didn't need to become expert sailors if they could force sea battles to happen on Roman terms. That's why they built the Corvus, a giant boarding bridge with a massive iron spike underneath. When a Roman ship came close to an enemy vessel, the Corvus slammed down like a giant trap, the spike biting deep into the enemy deck. That locked the ships together instantly. No more maneuvering, no more fancy sailing techniques. The moment the bridge dropped, the sea battle stopped being a naval engagement and became a land fight, exactly what Rome was good at. Carthaginian sailors, skilled in speed and ramming tactics, suddenly found themselves stuck in place, facing Roman infantry charging across the bridge. They weren't trained for tight shield-to-shield combat. Roman legionaries were. That difference flipped entire battles. The Romans didn't sink ships, they captured them, which meant they kept expanding their fleet during the war. At the Battle of Mylae, they captured dozens of Carthaginian ships. At Ecnomus, one of the largest naval battles in ancient history, the Corvus helped Rome turn what should have been a Carthaginian victory into a disaster. But the Corvus wasn't perfect. It made Roman ships top-heavy, dangerous in rough seas, and easier to capsize during storms. Still, in calm waters where battles actually happened, it was a game-changer. Rome used engineering, not tradition, to win a war they had no business winning. The Corvus proved one of the biggest truths about the Roman military. They didn't just fight harder, they fought smarter. When they lacked skill, they invented solutions. When they lacked advantage, they created their own rules. And when an enemy thought they had the upper hand, Rome found a way to take it from them. Number 5. the fake retreat that killed overconfident enemies. The feigned retreat looked simple from the outside runaway, let the enemy chase, then turn and strike. But in reality, it required discipline that only a highly trained army could pull off. The Romans didn't invent the tactic, and for a long time, they were actually victims of it. Early Roman commanders loved aggressive charges. Many thought that if the enemy turned their back, it meant the battle was already won. That assumption got them killed more than once. Cavalry would chase too far. Infantry would break formation. Before they knew it, fresh enemy troops were waiting in the hills or behind tree lines, ready to cut the Romans down. Rome eventually learned its lesson, and once they integrated the tactic into their own playbook, they used it with cold precision. A proper false retreat required soldiers to turn their backs while still keeping their ranks intact. They had to move quickly enough to appear panicked, but not so fast that their formation stretched out. Most soldiers in the ancient world simply couldn't do this. Once they ran, they truly ran. But Roman soldiers trained endlessly to obey commands, even while moving backward or withdrawing. They learned to ignore the instinct that tells a person to either stand and fight or flee completely. The real genius behind the feigned retreat was psychological manipulation. Rome understood that many ancient armies weren't built on discipline, they were built on emotion. When the enemy thought victory was near, they chased with excitement, yelling, sprinting, and abandoning formation. And that exact moment was what Roman commanders waited for. As soon as the enemy line stretched out and became disorganized, the Roman soldiers would stop, turn as one, raise their shields, and reform the line in seconds. Instead of catching terrified fugitives, the pursuing warriors suddenly ran headfirst into a wall of iron. Entire battles flipped in an instant. What looked like a victory became a slaughter. The tactic punished arrogance, overconfidence, and emotional fighting. Rome learned that pride kills more soldiers than swords, and a retreat real or fake was the fastest way to expose that weakness. This tactic reminded every enemy commander of a hard truth. Chasing a Roman line was never a guarantee of victory. Sometimes it was the beginning of your own destruction. Number 6. The double wall that crushed an entire nation. The siege of Alesia is often told as a famous victory, but what's usually missing is just how insane the engineering behind it truly was. Caesar didn't simply surround a city, he built an entire artificial battlefield. Most generals would have waited for reinforcements or attempted a risky assault on the walls. Caesar instead ordered his men to build 2 complete defensive fortifications, one facing inward to trap the Gauls inside, and another facing outward to prepare for the massive relief army marching to save them. In less than a month, the Romans constructed over 20 kilometers of defense lines across uneven hills, valleys, and forest edges. They dug deep ditches filled with water to break cavalry charges. They built sharpened stakes buried in the ground so that anyone running across the field would be impaled before they ever reached the main walls. They created layers of pits designed to slow the enemy's advance and break their formations. Every trap had a purpose. Every detail was planned. Caesar wasn't just building defenses. He was reshaping the terrain itself into a place where only the Romans had the advantage. Inside Alesia, the Gauls grew desperate as supplies ran low. Outside, hundreds of thousands of warriors gathered to rescue them. When the relief army finally attacked, the Romans were hit on 2 fronts at once. Caesar's forces had to fight inward and outward at the same time, switching between walls under constant pressure. There were moments when both lines nearly collapsed. But Roman discipline once again carried the day. Soldiers quickly moved from tower to tower, reinforcing whichever section needed help, communicating through signals and horn calls. The walls held. The traps did their job. And when the Gauls inside attempted a coordinated breakout, they found themselves blocked by the same deadly maze of fortifications. By the end of the battle, the Gallic resistance was shattered. What amazed ancient observers wasn't just the victory, it was the scale of the operation. Building 1 fortified ring is standard in siege warfare. Building 2 rings, facing opposite directions, under enemy pressure, while controlling the terrain on every side. No one in the ancient world had ever seen anything like it. Alesia became the ultimate example of Roman adaptability. If the natural battlefield wasn't favorable, the Romans simply built a new one. Number 7. Turning war elephants into weaknesses. War elephants were considered living tanks in the ancient world. Their size alone terrified infantry. A single charge could crush shields, trample cavalry, and break the morale of even experienced soldiers. Many armies collapsed the moment they saw an elephant advancing. But the Roman army didn't panic, at least, not for long. After suffering early defeats, they set out to understand exactly how elephants behaved. And once they learned the animal's weaknesses, they turned the most intimidating weapon of the ancient world into a liability. The first step was recognizing that elephants, for all their power, were still animals. They were sensitive to sound, pain, and confusion. So the Romans developed tactics focused not on overpowering the beasts, but on controlling them. Instead of facing them head-on, they opened deliberate lanes in their formations. When the elephants charged, they charged straight through empty paths with little resistance. Confused and unable to stop quickly, the animals ended up behind the Roman line, where they had no handler support and were isolated from their own troops. Roman infantry then attacked the elephants from the sides, targeting legs, tendons, and eyes, areas impossible for the animals to defend. When necessary, the Romans used more extreme solutions. One of the strangest and most disturbing was the use of flaming pigs. The squeals of burning animals created such overwhelming panic that the elephants often turned around and trampled their own armies in terror. Brutal? Absolutely. But ancient warfare was cruel, and Rome understood that fear was sometimes more powerful than steel. They also dug trenches, laid spikes, and built earthworks that made elephant charges ineffective or downright impossible. These methods weren't theoretical. They were proven in major battles. At the Battle of Beneventum, open lanes disrupted Pyrrhus's elephants and allowed Rome to counterattack effectively. At Zama, Scipio Africanus used the same concept to neutralize Hannibal's elephants. The charge failed, the animals panicked, and the Carthaginian line broke apart. Rome succeeded because they didn't treat elephants as supernatural monsters. They treated them as a tactical problem and solved it with logic. Once Rome learned how to break elephant charges, these mighty beasts stopped being a threat and became a liability for any commander brave enough to use them. Number 8. The punishment. So terrifying. It kept the legions unbreakable. Most people today imagine ancient armies relying on loyalty, honor, or motivation. Rome relied on something far stronger: fear. The harshest example of this was decimation, a punishment reserved for legions that mutinied, deserted, or shamed themselves in battle. It was one of the most terrifying disciplinary measures in human history, and it worked. A legion chosen for decimation was divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The unlucky soldier who drew the marked stone was executed on the spot, not by officers, but by his fellow soldiers. They were forced to beat or stab him to death, knowing they might have been the one chosen instead. Those who survived didn't escape punishment. They were fed starvation rations, often barley instead of wheat. They were made to sleep outside the fortified camp like criminals. Their shame followed them for months, sometimes years. But the real power of decimation wasn't the physical punishment. It was the psychological one. Soldiers learned that no matter how terrifying the enemy was, their own commanders could be worse. No one wanted to be responsible for their unit's failure. No one wanted to be the man who brought dishonor to the legion. This fear created an iron bond of discipline. Roman soldiers stayed in formation when others would break. They held the line under overwhelming pressure. They obeyed orders instantly, even when exhausted or surrounded. They fought not only for Rome, but for their own survival inside the ranks. Decimation was used rarely because its reputation alone did most of the work. The threat hung over every soldier like a shadow. Other armies feared the enemy in front of them. Romans feared the consequences behind them. That difference is part of why Roman legions became the most consistent and reliable fighting force of the ancient world. Their discipline wasn't just enforced, it was carved into their culture.